3 years without a human voice, and now 6 women were kneeling in his dirt. Thaddius Bell froze in the doorway, the sun beating down hard enough to bleach the color from the world, and still he could see them clear as a nightmare. Torn dresses, skin the color of dust, faces streaked with sweat and tears. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17, the oldest maybe 25. None of them belonged here. If you're a true Wild West soul, drop a big yes in the comments. Let's see who's still riding the trail with us. He gripped the porch railing, rough wood biting into his palms. No one came to this valley by accident. It was 2 days' ride through country that could kill a man before breakfast, and he'd chosen it for exactly that reason. He wanted to be alone, needed it. 3 years ago, the last living thing that mattered to him was taken, and he'd walked away from the world rather than face what he'd become. But here they were, on their knees in the blazing dirt like broken dolls, and something in the way they stared up at him punched through the walls he'd spent years building. The woman in front raised her head. Auburn hair clung to her face, her green eyes wild with exhaustion and something worse. When she opened her mouth, the sound was barely more than a scrape of breath, but he heard it all the same. "Please, they're hunting us." The word struck him like a bullet. Hunting. His chest tightened. Memories he'd buried deep began clawing their way back. Another woman, another desperate plea, another moment he'd turned away. He could still do it. All he had to do was step back inside, close the door, let the desert take them. In a day, there'd be nothing left but wind-blown bones. But his boots didn't move. His hands didn't loosen on the railing. Far out across the hardpan, the faint rhythm of hoofbeats began to rise. They came out of the heat shimmer like ghosts, 6 shapes staggering through the dust, heads bowed, skirts in tatters. Thaddius Bell stood on his porch and watched them draw closer, each step measured like it might be their last. The air was so dry it scraped his throat raw, but he couldn't look away. For 3 years, no one had crossed his fence line. Now, 6 strangers were about to fall at his feet. The one in front reached him first. She had auburn hair matted with sweat, her face streaked with dirt, lips cracked to bleeding. She didn't speak right away, just knelt in the dirt like her legs had given out. The others followed, dropping beside her in a line, too thin, too pale, eyes wide with the kind of fear a man didn't forget once he'd seen it. "Please," the auburn-haired woman said at last, her voice little more than a croak. "We need help." He felt the words like grit under his skin. 3 years of solitude had taught him what happened when you let other people's troubles inside your walls. Trouble stayed. Trouble burned you down to nothing. "You need to keep moving," he said. His voice sounded harsh even to him. "Ain't nothing here for you." She swayed where she knelt, one hand pressed to her side. When she pulled it away, he saw the dark stain spreading through her torn dress. Blood. Fresh. He glanced at the others. Bruises, rope burns, hollow cheeks. Whatever had done this to them was still out there. "They're hunting us," she whispered. "They took our wagon 3 days back, killed our guide." Her breath caught and her gaze darted over his shoulder to the empty horizon. "If they find us..." The wind shifted, and with it came the faint, steady drum of hoofbeats. Thaddius's gut clenched. Out here, that sound carried far, and it meant only one thing: riders coming hard. He knew without asking they weren't the kind of men you welcome to your porch. His instincts screamed to turn away, to shut his door, to let the desert finish what it had started with these women. That was the deal he'd made with himself when he came here. No past, no ties, no rescues. The world had already taken enough from him. But as the auburn-haired woman lifted her face again, he saw something in her eyes, raw desperation laced with a flicker of hope, the kind that burned fast and died quicker if no one fed it. He realized his hands were already tightening on the porch rail, not in retreat, but in readiness. The hoofbeats grew louder. "Inside," he said before he could change his mind. "Hunted," she said, and the word hit him like a blow to the chest. Thaddius Bell had heard it before. Out here, it meant more than just being chased. It meant someone had already marked you, already decided how and where you'd die. He looked down at the woman who'd spoken, the auburn-haired one who could barely stay upright. Clara, she'd said her name was. The syllables were shaky, as if even speaking cost her more strength than she had to spare. Her eyes darted toward the horizon, searching for shapes in the heat shimmer. "They're close," she whispered. "We've been running for days. No water since yesterday." The other women shifted uneasily. One of them, a girl with corn silk hair and eyes too old for her face, pressed her back to the fence post like she expected gunfire at any moment. Another, with a split lip and a purpling bruise down her cheek, held her torn shawl tight around her shoulders, though the heat was enough to bake a man's skin. Thaddius's mind worked against itself. He wanted to keep his silence, to shove these women back into the desert and let them vanish the way everything else had since Sarah died. But something about them didn't fit the picture of ordinary desperation. The injuries weren't from a fall or a bad trail. The bruises were shaped like hands. Rope burns ringed their wrists. Clara tried to straighten but nearly fell forward, catching herself with one hand in the dirt. "They took our wagon," she said. "Killed our guide. Said they'd do worse if we didn't come quietly. But we ran. We've been running ever since." Her voice broke on the last word, and Thaddius knew, without wanting to, that she was telling the truth. Whoever they were, they'd already caught up to these women once, and they'd do it again. The wind shifted. This time the sound wasn't just in Clara's voice. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, rolled across the hard pan from the south. The rhythm was practiced. Men who knew how to track. Men who were closing in. Thaddius clenched his jaw until it ached. This wasn't his fight. He'd made sure of that the day he walked into this valley and built walls between himself and every living soul. But as he looked at Clara, her face pale beneath the dirt, her hand pressed to her bleeding side, he knew what would happen if he sent them away now. The desert would finish them before the riders even had to. The hoofbeats grew louder. The women heard them too. Fear flashed in their eyes, raw and helpless. Thaddius swore under his breath, the sound tasting like rust in his mouth. "Inside," he said. And just like that, the walls he'd built for 3 years began to crumble. The hoofbeats were no longer distant. They were steady now, deliberate. The kind of pace a man kept when he knew his prey couldn't outrun him. Thaddius Bell moved fast, waving the women toward the cabin. Clara stumbled on the porch steps, catching herself with a hand slick with her own blood. "Who's coming?" he asked, though part of him already knew. The women exchanged glances, silent, until Clara met his eyes. "Slavers." The word was a knife, clean and sharp, sliding straight through the air between them. Thaddius felt the desert heat press closer, heavier. "Not out here," he said, because the territories had been free soil for years, at least on paper. "They don't care what the paper says," Clara rasped. "They bought us from a man in Kansas who promised us work, teachers, seamstresses. Took us from a church social, drugged us. When we woke up, we were in chains." The girl with corn silk hair spoke then, her voice flat. "The man in charge is a federal marshal." Thaddius's head snapped toward her. "Name?" "Wade Garrett," Clara said. The name hit like a hammer to the ribs. 3 years since he'd heard it. 3 years since the man had come to his door with smooth lies and dead eyes, offering protection he didn't want and demanding Sarah as payment when he couldn't meet the price. Garrett had taken her anyway. Thaddius had run. He forced the memory down. "Get inside, now." They obeyed, moving with the awkward, shuffling gait of the half-starved and half-dead. Inside, the cabin seemed suddenly too small, the air thick with fear and dust. Thaddius crossed to the window and peered through the narrow gap in the shutters. A thin cloud of dust smudged the horizon. 6 riders, maybe more, their silhouettes sharp against the glare. They rode in a tight, confident line, the way men do when they know exactly where they're going. Clara leaned against the wall, her hand still clamped over her wound. "They'll burn this place if they have to. Kill you. Kill us." Thaddius opened the cabinet by the hearth and took out his rifle. The weight felt foreign after so long, but his fingers knew the motions. Outside, the riders spread out, angling toward the ranch from different sides. It was a net, and it was closing. "Marshal Garrett's got connections," Clara said, "in 3 territories. If we go to the law, he'll hear about it before we finish talking, and then we disappear." Thaddius chambered around, the sound loud in the cramped room. He didn't answer her. He was staring at the riders, at the glint of sunlight off something pinned to one man's chest. A badge. The hoofbeats shook the ground now, close enough to rattle the glass in the window. Thaddius exhaled slowly, steady in his hands. The past had found him, and it was riding straight to his door. Wade Garrett. The name alone was enough to drag the air from Thaddius Bell's lungs. It echoed in his skull, heavy as a hammer on iron, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. He saw the cabin door from 3 years ago, Sarah standing there with the light behind her, and Garrett on the porch, smiling like he owned the world. That smile hadn't changed in his mind. Lazy, sharp, promising ruin to anyone who thought to stand in his way. Thaddius had told himself 1,000 times there'd been no winning that day. Garrett had men. Guns. Authority stamped in tin and leather. But the truth was uglier. He hadn't fought. He'd let fear choke him while Garrett's men pulled Sarah into the saddle and rode away. The sound of her voice calling his name once, sharp and certain, had chased him ever since. Now, in the stifling heat of his one-room cabin, that same man was closing in again. Clara was watching him from where she leaned against the wall, her green eyes gauging his reaction. She'd said Garrett's name like she knew what it meant. "You know him." It wasn't a question. Thaddius forced his jaw to unlock. "I know him." The girl with the corn silk hair spoke next, soft but clear. "He's worse than the others. The others follow orders. Garrett makes the orders." Thaddius turned back to the window. The dust cloud was closer now, the riders' shapes cutting sharper against the glare. Garrett would be in front. He always liked to lead, to be seen. Thaddius could almost picture him, hat tipped just so, badge catching the sun. Something inside him shifted then, a slow grind of stone over stone. The fear was still there, deep in his gut, but it was hardening into something else. Not the cold detachment he'd worn like armor for 3 years, not even anger. This was older, sharper. A promise made to a dying woman he hadn't been able to keep until now. "You said he's been tracking you for days," Thaddius said, still watching the dust cloud swell. "That means he's tired. His men are tired. That's the only edge we're gonna get." Clara's brow furrowed. "You're thinking of fighting him." Thaddius didn't answer. The rifle in his hands felt steadier now, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as he had. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, the cadence slow and sure, a hunter's rhythm. Thaddius could almost hear Garrett's voice riding on the wind, smooth and confident, the same way it had sounded the day he'd taken Sarah. Only this time, Thaddius wasn't going to stand still. This time, Wade Garrett was riding into a fight. The riders fanned out as they closed in, 6 of them moving with the precision of men who'd done this before. Dust hung in the air behind them, catching the sun like smoke. Thaddius stood on his porch, rifle held low but ready, Watching as Wade Garrett reined in his horse at the front. "Afternoon, friend," Garrett called, his voice carrying smooth over the dry air. "We're looking for runaway property. 6 women. You seen anyone like that?" Thaddius's fingers tightened on the stock. Garrett looked almost exactly as he remembered. Sharp suit under a trail coat, hat low over eyes that never warmed. The tin badge on his vest flashed in the sunlight, a mockery of justice. "Haven't seen anybody," Thaddius said, his voice flat. "Don't get many visitors out here." Garrett smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's so. Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes folks hide in places they think are clever." "This is private property," Thaddius replied. One of the riders spat into the dirt. "Federal authority trumps private property, hermit. You hiding something?" Garrett swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd never had to hurry in his life. His boots crunched on the packed earth as he stepped toward the porch. "Funny thing about men who live alone," he said. "Usually means they got secrets." His gaze slid over the porch, the windows, the closed door. "What's yours?" Thaddius didn't answer. "We've been tracking those women for 3 days," Garrett went on. "Lost the trail a mile back. I figure a smart man might have helped cover it. Question is, why?" Inside the cabin there was a faint sound, a stifled breath, maybe a muffled shift of weight. In the stillness, it was loud enough to catch Garrett's attention. His head tilted, like a wolf catching a scent. "What was that?" he asked. "Wind," Thaddius said quickly. "Loose board in the roof." Garrett's smile sharpened. "Boys," he called over his shoulder, "I think our friend's keeping company." He stepped up onto the porch, his hand resting casual-like on the grip of his pistol. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step aside, and we're going to collect what's ours. Anyone gets in the way ends up in the dirt." From behind the cabin door, a whisper floated out. Clara's voice, faint but clear enough for Thaddius to hear. "That's him. That's the man who killed your wife." The words lit a fuse in his chest. 3 years of grief and guilt flared into something hotter, cleaner. Thaddius raised his rifle, the barrel finding Garrett's heart in one smooth motion. "I said this is private property," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I meant it." Garrett's smirk was the same as it had been 3 years ago. Sharp, cold, meant to cut a man down before the bullet did. "You're making a mistake, friend," he said softly. "Big one. Your wife made the same mistake. Died calling your name, wondering why her brave husband didn't come." The words slid under Thaddius' skin like a blade, twisting in the oldest wound he carried. For years he'd replayed that night, hearing her voice in the dark, hearing himself not answer. He'd built his exile on the certainty that she had died afraid, abandoned. But then Clara's voice came from inside the cabin, shaking, but fierce enough to burn through the heat. "He's lying." Garrett's head snapped toward the sound. "Shut your mouth, woman." Clara didn't. She pushed herself upright against the wall, her face pale but her eyes locked on Thaddius. "Sarah Bell didn't die calling for you. I was there. I was one of the women he took before her. Blonde hair, blue eyes, scar on her left hand from a cooking accident." Thaddius's breath caught. "She fought," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "Broke a man's nose, nearly blinded another. And when Garrett cornered her, she wasn't calling for you. She was cursing his name." For a moment, the world narrowed to that single truth. Sarah hadn't died waiting for him to save her. She'd gone down swinging, the way she'd lived, fierce, stubborn, unbroken. The image burned away the picture Garrett had painted in his mind for years, and with it went the weight that had chained him in this valley. Garrett sneered, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that looked a lot like doubt. "She died just the same," he said, but it landed flat. "No," Thaddius said, his voice low, steady. She died fighting you. And now, so will I." The air between them felt charged, tight as a drawn wire. Thaddius's hands no longer trembled. The rifle was an extension of his body, his stance rooted in something solid, something he'd thought he had lost the night Sarah was taken. Garrett's smile faltered. "You've been riding this territory like you own it," Thaddius said. "Selling people like cattle, hiding behind a badge, but that ends here. Think you can stop me?" Garrett's tone was mocking, but there was a new weight in it, a wariness. "I know I can," Thaddius said, and for the first time in 3 years, he meant it. The sun beat down, the dust hung still in the air, and somewhere behind him, Clara's breathing steadied. The shame was gone, burned out of him by the truth. All that was left was the fight. Garrett's hand twitched toward his gun. Thaddius didn't flinch. The world seemed to hold its breath. Garrett's hand hovered near his pistol, his smile gone. His eyes hard and calculating. Thaddius saw the flick of a tendon in his wrist, the subtle shift of weight in his boots. He didn't wait for the draw. The rifle bucked in his hands, the crack split in the stillness like a lightning strike. Garrett jerked back as if yanked by an invisible rope, his badge catching the sun one last time before he tumbled off the porch. Blood spread across his black vest, dark and final. For a heartbeat, the yard was silent. Then all hell broke loose. Garrett's men roared in anger, their guns flashing as the first bullets tore into the porch, splintering the railing and shattering the cabin windows. Thaddius dove behind the water trough, working the rifle's lever by instinct. The first shot dropped a man from his saddle, sending his horse screaming into the dust. Inside the cabin, Clara's voice cut through the chaos. "The root cellar! Weapons!" The cabin door flew open, and she appeared with a shotgun braced against her shoulder. Blood still soaked her side, but her stance was steady. She fired both barrels at the nearest rider, knocking him backward into the dirt. 2 more women spilled out after her, rifles clutched awkwardly in their hands. They took cover at the porch posts, firing in short, sharp bursts. Thaddius caught a glimpse of the youngest, corn silk hair plastered to her forehead, fumbling to reload a pistol far too big for her grip, but refusing to step back. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat. Horses screamed. Men shouted orders that were drowned by the thunder of shots. Thaddius shifted position, firing into the chaos, forcing the slavers to scatter. One of them made a rush toward the porch, ducking low, but the fever-sick girl raised her pistol and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but the man flinched, buying Thaddius the half-second he needed to put him down. The fight was brutal and close. There was no room for hesitation. Every pull of the trigger meant the difference between life and death. The women fought like cornered wolves. Their fear burned away in the fire of survival. Another rider turned to flee, and Clara's shotgun boomed again, the blast tearing him from the saddle. The remaining men broke, spurring their horses hard, leaving their dead in the dust. The sudden quiet was deafening. Thaddius rose slowly from behind the trough, his rifle still hot in his hands. Garrett lay face up in the dirt where he'd fallen, his eyes glassy, the smirk forever wiped from his face. 3 years of silence had ended in gunfire. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Thaddius felt the weight in his chest shift. Not gone, but lighter, as if a debt had just been paid in full. The dust from the retreating riders drifted across the yard, settling in the churned earth like the aftermath of a storm. The echo of gunfire still clung to the air, sharp and acrid, but the valley had gone still again. Only the rasp of the women's breathing and the creak of settling wood broke the silence. Garrett lay where he'd fallen, his hat half crushed beneath him, the badge on his chest dulled by blood. Thaddius stood over him, rifle hanging at his side, staring down at the man who'd haunted his nights for 3 years. He'd imagined this moment countless times, pulling the trigger, watching Garrett fall, feeling the weight lift. but the relief was thin, hollow. Sarah was still gone. Nothing could change that. Clara stepped up beside him, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. Her face was pale but steady. "He can't hurt anyone else now," she said. Thaddius didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the cabin, its windows shattered, the porch peppered with bullet holes. The fight had left scars on everything it touched. "No," he said finally, "but it took too long." The other women gathered near the trough, tending to the fever-sick girl who sat shivering despite the heat. The youngest had found a rag and was wiping the sweat from her brow, murmuring soft words that didn't carry. One by one, they looked toward Thaddius, as if waiting for him to decide what came next. Clara broke the silence. "We've talked about it. There's a town 2 territories north, small place. They need teachers, seamstresses, good folks, the kind who won't ask too many questions." The women nodded, their eyes shadowed but resolute. They had been prey for too long. Now, even wounded and weary, they were speaking of a future. Thaddius studied them, the bruises, the torn clothes, the stubborn light in their eyes. They had fought beside him when they could have hidden. He owed them more than sending them back into the desert. "I can get you that far," he said. "Make sure you reach it in one piece." Clara's lips curved in the faintest smile. "And you? Going back to your silence?" He looked past her, across the valley. The land he'd once seen as a fortress now felt empty, stripped of its purpose. "No," he said. "I think I've been alone long enough." A hot wind carried the last of the dust away, revealing the tracks that led out of the valley. They were deep and clear, pointing north. Garrett's body lay still in the sun, the final mark of the life Thaddius had been living. Without another word, he turned toward the cabin to gather what they'd need. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he was ready to walk it. Spring came slow to New Haven, the kind that coaxed green from the earth 1 stubborn inch at a time. The town was small, 6 streets, a scattering of weathered buildings, but it had room enough for the living to make something better than what they'd left behind. Thaddius Bell stood in front of the 1-room schoolhouse, its fresh pine walls glowing in the morning light. He'd built it board by board, the same way he'd once built fences to keep the world out. Only this time, his hands had worked for something meant to let people in. The windows were clean, the bell over the doorway polished until it caught the sun. It was a place made for beginnings. Inside, the sound of laughter spilled through the open door. High, unsteady voices belonging to children who'd never known the kind of fear that had driven Clara and the others across the desert. Clara moved among them, her auburn hair tied back, her side fully healed. She wore Sarah's wedding ring, the gold warm against her skin, not as a replacement but as a promise that some love could carry more than one lifetime. Thaddius watched her for a moment before stepping inside. The women had all found their places here, teaching letters, sewing clothes, tending gardens. Grace, the girl who'd once been fevered and near death, now stood tall at the chalkboard, guiding a boy's hand as he shaped his first letters. She glanced at Thaddius and grinned, and he saw none of the hollow fear that had shadowed her face the day they'd met. When the lesson paused, Clara came to him, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "The desks turned out perfect," she said. "You've got a gift for building things." He smiled, faint but real. "Guess I just needed the right reason." They stepped outside together, the air carrying the scent of blooming sage from the hills. Thaddius glanced down the main street, where wagons rattled past and people moved about their business without looking over their shoulders. It was the opposite of the valley he'd once called home, and for the first time, he didn't miss the silence. At the edge of town, the road stretched toward the horizon, the same horizon he'd once feared would bring trouble to his door. Now it was just a line between the past and the life he'd chosen. Clara slipped her hand into his. "She'd be proud of you," she said quietly. Thaddius didn't have to ask who she meant. He could almost hear Sarah's voice in the soft rush of wind through the wildflowers. Fierce, certain, unbroken. And for the first time since she'd been taken from him, the thought didn't hurt. It felt like peace. That's the end of the trail, folks. Drop a yes if you're a true Wild West fan. Thanks for riding with me.